Good afternoon and welcome. I'm John Stack, the founding dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs here at Florida International University. It's an honor to be here with you today and to welcome you to this event recognizing International Human Rights Day, which is observed every year on the 10th of December. As many of you know, this is the anniversary of the day in 1948 that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a milestone document that proclaims the inalienable rights all people are entitled to as human beings, regardless of their race, color, religion, sex, language, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Now available in more than 500 languages, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the most translated document in the world. We are so pleased to have such a distinguished gathering of scholars with us to discuss the importance of this historic document to our world today. And it is more important than ever as we face some of the most difficult political, social, and economic challenges of our lifetimes. It is also especially significant here at our FIU, where we have such a diverse community of students and their families, some of whom have had to flee human rights abuses in their homelands. So there is a special appreciation for this topic for so many of us. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank the many sponsors who have helped make today's event possible. First of all, Havakla Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, and our director of the program, Ambassador Martine Palus, is a great champion for human rights and is here with us to help moderate. Thank you very much, Martin. We are also grateful to our Dorothea Green Lecture Series, generously endowed by Ambassador Stephen J. Green, his wife Dorothy, and daughter Kimberly Green, and the Green Family Foundation. I also wish to recognize our European and Eurasian Studies program, led by David Kramer, its director, our director, and a senior fellow there who is also here today. Thank you for everything as always, David. And thank you to the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, one of our great partners on these kinds of events. Our African and African Diaspora Studies program and its director, Dr. Valerie Patterson. Thank you, Valerie, as well. In the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, which is doing some very exciting programming as well. Thank you to our own director, history professor Rebecca Friedman, for all that you do. I also want to acknowledge the three very distinguished scholars who are joining us today virtually, including one who joined us on another very important day more than 10 years ago. It was a launch for our inaugural geopolitical summit in 2010, which coincided with the creation of the FIU School of International and Public Affairs, now named in honor of Stephen J. Green. On that day, we brought together some of the world's leading foreign policy experts to discuss America's changing role in the world. And among them was Dr. Francis Fukiyama, who is here with us today. Welcome, Dr. Fukiyama. It is wonderful to have you back virtually on campus, and we hope to see you very soon. Another good friend to FIU and the Green School who is here with us is Ms. Nicole Bibbin-Sadaka, who has made several appearances at our now annual State of the World event. I should mention that important Green School event will happen this spring on February 1 through 5. So please mark your calendars for it. And welcome, Nicole. We're thrilled to have you with us. And finally, a distinguished guest who is making his first appearance here at FIU and we hope he will certainly return, is Dr. Jacques Rupnik, who joins us from CRI Sciences Po in Paris. Welcome. We're delighted to have you, Dr. Rupnik. And now, without further ado, I will turn the program over to my good friend and colleague, the distinguished director of our Václav Havel program, the Human Rights and Diplomacy, Ambassador Martin Palouse.
Thank you, John. First of all, thank you everybody who has decided to participate in this event. First of all, obviously our three distinguished speakers and all the personnel who is making this event possible. We are really grateful for that. Certainly human rights is a central mission of our Václav Havel program for human rights here and diplomacy at Florida International University. And the name Václav Havel sends a signal where we are coming from, what is maybe background experience and point of departure of our approach. I'm honored that I have a chance to moderate this panel together with my good friend and colleague, David Kramer, with whom I've been cooperating in this project for years already now. So what is the topic? The topic are two basic concepts. One is inherent human dignity that has a well-defined place, in my view, in the current international, public international law. It was introduced by Universal Declaration of Human Rights and further developed in adjacent documents and conventions in this regard. On the other side, we have human identity. Human identity is now a very popular concept. It's in circulation very intensively in last years, and identity politics seems to be one of the key dynamic element in our political discussions. So the question is, what is the relationship between these two? Is there any problem if we, on one hand, have a legal concept that is, as I've said, well-defined, and on the other side, a very dynamic concept that has power, really, not only to enlighten, but unite, but also divide people participating in these discussions. So what's going to happen now? I will ask our three panelists in the order that already has been said. First, Frank Fukuyama will go because he is the author of many important contributions to our debate, but namely in this context, his book from 2018, Identity, I think has brought a very significant contribution to that debate. After that, I will ask Nicole Bibin-Sedaka to make her points. And last but not least, Jacques Rupnik from Paris, my good colleague in Václav Havel Library. We are both members of board of that entity operating from Prague. But before I ask Frank to make his opening statement, let me read from you, from Václav Havel. This is what he said under the occasion of inauguration of the Human Rights Building in Strasbourg in France, June 29, 1995. So he tried to present here what he called his concert opinion. And the opinion said, while the present day concept of human rights indeed takes a form which derives from the state of civilization today, the set of values and imperatives which it reflects is rooted elsewhere in a deeper, truly profound inner experience, an archetypal human experience of the world and of humanity itself within this world. Already in long bygone times, long before the term human rights was coined, the human mind realized that the higher order of being of which it is a part puts it under certain obligation. And further more, there has been much discussion about whether human rights in the form which is now accepted in the Euro-American cultural sphere are truly universal. That is, whether their observance can be required of everyone, or whether they are only a product of one particular culture that cannot be imposed upon other cultures which are based on different world outlooks and different traditions. If we were to perceive human rights as a mere product of a social contract, the answer to this question would be clear. We would have no right whatsoever to demand that they be observed by anyone who has not subscribed to this construct or who has had no part in devising it. No group can justifiably claim that what its members have agreed upon among themselves applies automatically to everyone else as well. Nor can it purport that only what this particular group deems right is truly universal and right for all. But if, however, we recognize that respect for human rights as a political requirement or imperative is actually a political expression of moral obligations anchored in the general human experience of the absolute, any reasons for relativist skepticism seem to be valid. So this is the message from Václav Havel. And now, Frank Fukuyama, you are the first.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. And thank you also for sending the readings from other of Václav Havel's articles and speeches on this topic. So I just want to spend a little bit of time at a more theoretical level and begin by asking the question, where does the universalism of our current understanding of human rights come from? I believe that Havel himself actually noted this in one of those pieces, that historically, I do think it comes out of Christianity, the idea that all human beings are equal in the sight of God. And I think that what happened beginning in the 17th, 18th centuries was that this concept was secularized by people like Immanuel Kant or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and became the basis for our current understanding of the universalism of rights. And I actually would differ from him. I'm not sure what experience with the absolute really means. I do think that historically, if you say, why does anyone believe that all human beings are fundamentally equal? They're certainly not equal in strength or intelligence or, other important characteristics, but I believe, again, coming out of that Christian tradition, they are equal in their capacity for choice, and that the foundation of human dignity is actually the fact that human beings are moral agents, and that moral agency is what needs to be protected, and that's what's truly universal and cuts across all cultures. And as such, it becomes, one of the foundational principles for modern liberalism, which is also universalistic in that sense, and seeks to protect the rights of all people to speech, to association, and ultimately to a share of political power in which they can exercise that degree of choice and autonomy. Now, Havel in that article also notes that the Christian origins of this may, in a way, be used against the doctrine. People will say this is simply a Western concept. But I would say that at this point in human history, it's broken out way beyond the West. I would point to Alexis de Tocqueville's observation about the inexorable spread of the idea of equality around the world, and that this seemed to be something that had been going on for centuries. It seemed to be unstoppable. And I think that today, even if you don't accept the specific doctrinal baggage that's attached to the Western understanding of dignity and rights, the idea that people are fundamentally equal in their worth is something that's virtually accepted by every culture and every civilization. It's hard to find a regime that says, well, actually, this group of people is superior to everybody else in the society, and therefore they ought to be treated with greater respect and be given superior rights. So I do think that there is, despite the specifically Western origins, there is actually something empirically true about the universalism. Now, when we get to the question of identity, I think we bump up against some of the limits to a universalist understanding of human beings and of certainly of political rights. And I think there are two different problems with that. One has to do with what I would call moral psychology, that I think any human being is going to feel greater obligation to people that are closer to him or her in every respect. You always pay more attention to your child than to the child of somebody, 6,000 miles away. And in fact, I think a lot of our moral understandings really depend on the fact that you pay more attention to people that are closer to you. And they also, I think, are not simply isolated individuals. They're very social animals that desire community. That community can be based on a lot of different principles. It can be based on religion. It can be based on nation. It can be based on the fact that you're a member of a minority group that has been discriminated against and marginalized. But you're, I think, naturally going to feel emotionally closer to that group. And I think that if you live in a liberal society that defends universal human rights, where in effect, what you hold in common is this kind of thin humanity that everybody in the world shares, it's not going to be as satisfying as having let's say a similar set of religious beliefs that bond you very closely in a very complex doctrine to other human beings, or in a nation that has its own traditions, its own food, its own culture, its own language, and so forth. And so, I think these are the identity forces that we're now pushing up against in the current world. We had a liberal order that was guaranteed by the spread of liberal democracies in the whole period after 1945 up until, maybe 15 years ago when that movement peaked. But now we're increasingly seeing liberal democracy, which is the political form that respect for human rights takes, being increasingly challenged by other orders that are based on these more communitarian demands for identity that is more restricted and in some sense rejects the principle of moral universalism. And by the way, that rejection isn't just from religious or nationalistic people on the right. It can also come from people on the left who believe that, for example, the ideal in a democracy shouldn't be a colorblind democracy. It should actually be respect for individual cultural groups and autonomy for the group rather than autonomy for individuals. That's one set of problems. The other set of problems is I would call a kind of practical political one. Rights may be universal, but they are actually enforced by states, by nations, and without that enforcement power, they oftentimes really don't mean anything. And for better or worse, nations are territorial in their jurisdiction. They can enforce rights over the territory that they control, but they have very limited impact on what goes on beyond their borders. And although, many democratic countries have supported human rights abroad, the principle is a little bit complicated, because if you lived in a world where every state felt, a right and indeed an obligation to enforce rights beyond its borders, you would be living in a rather chaotic world. And so the organization of the world into nations means that the universalism runs into certain practical limits, that this is really something that's oftentimes in the purview of states. We criticize states for violating rights because states really have the power to either protect them or to violate them. I would conclude just by making a simple observation, which is that the concept of identity is not fixed. There are many people around the world that do think that it's rooted in biology or in some kind of overwhelming historical experience that binds a certain group of people together. And I think if you look at this carefully, that notion is ridiculous. Identity is what we call socially constructed. And so although you can build a identity around a particular understanding of the nation, like Viktor Orban saying that Hungarian identity is related to Hungarian ethnicity. That's just one formulation of identity, but it doesn't need to be ethnic. It doesn't need to be religious. And in fact, since we do depend on liberal democracies to define and enforce our rights, identity can also be built around democracy itself. And I think that this was one of the great achievements of the United States after the civil rights era, when the United States came out of this period when citizenship and identity had been defined in racial terms, which was a very serious undermining of the universal respect for rights that the Declaration of Independence nominally gave voice to. And I do think that American identity as a democracy was strong, but it was based really on political principles of freedom and equality rather than being based on race, religion, ethnicity, or any of these smaller forms of identity. So I guess I would just conclude by saying I don't think we can get away from identity, the idea of identity. And in fact, all societies need to have a shared identity. Otherwise, they're simply not going to cohere as societies. But those identities are very plastic. They can be changed, they can be constructed, and they can be constructed in ways that are compatible with the universalism, the underlying universalism of human rights, subject to these practical considerations about citizenship and territorial limits and so forth. And so ultimately, I don't think that there should be a fundamental contradiction between the universalism of human rights and the requirements of running an actual liberal democratic nation state. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a great start. And now directly to Nicole Bibbins-Sedaka. You have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel with such distinguished thinkers and thought leaders. I want to pick up on many of the places where Frank just left off, and particularly on this issue of identity being fluid. Identity has always existed in every society in different ways, but certainly we've seen identity just changes over time. In fact, within one person to another, it certainly changes within the context in which they find themselves. So as we reflect on why the UDHR, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, would start with a term like human dignity, particularly at a time just shortly after a time where the world saw such extraordinary devastation, and particularly human devastation in the form of the Holocaust, which was unquestionably driven by an issue of identity. We have to sort of ask ourselves why the UDHR would use that term at a time where the world was wrestling with this great identity question. And I'll come back to that at the end. Let me make two main comments, but I want us to also, as we wrestle with these concepts, recognize that this question of identity and human dignity we're having this conversation amongst three really important global dynamics, which will unquestionably shape the conversation which we're having. One is a massive recession in democracy around the world. Democracies are based on the universal values or the universal respect for human rights. Second is a massive movement of people and the highest displacement that we've ever seen of people around the world. Quite often that displacement is caused because of persecution based on identity, and you have people moving into new societies in which their identity then is fluid. And the third is obviously this larger question that we're having in the world about race, about about discrimination and the systemic challenges that we've faced with race. And so it's really important that we recognize this moment that we're in and how that impacts it. Let me go back to your first question, Martin, which was really about how do we look at these two concepts together and what is the relationship of the two. So first, let me say, as I look at identity, I see it very much as compounded by, or made conflictual by, or even created because of the absence of human dignity. So what do I mean by that? All of us have an identity, all of us feel an identity, but quite often the identity that surfaces the most surfaces, in my view, because of a lack of a respect for human dignity. Okay, so it's absolutely natural, and I agree with Frank, and all of us group by nature around whatever our group is, right? That could be our faith group, it could be our ethnic or religious group, it could be some other grouping, and that is just a normal human reaction to want to live in community with someone, and you have to bond something. But what we see is this issue of identity comes up in a problematic way where we see scarcity. Whether we see scarcity of food or water or access to political power or access to economic power, that is when we most often see this question of identity come into conflict and to be surfaced the most. And we also see then identity is not just something that we have as part of what we do, but it becomes a driving force and a conflictual force. Just looking at it in the context of the United States, we see so many groups that emigrated to the United States that had a conflictual relationship early in their time. But as they had access to resources, opportunity, that identity became somewhat less important to them. Now, we look at Italian Americans or Catholic Americans who came to the United States, really challenging access issues for them in their early days. It's still a part of many Americans' heritage and identity, but it is in a way which is not necessarily a driving and conflictual force. We look at, let me just name two other groups, which are obviously right now at the center of a lot of the conversations about identity politics. African Americans whose history in the United States has been one in which human dignity has been at the center of their challenges, whether it has been under slavery, under Jim Crow, or under segregation. The issue of the lack of access, the scarcity, and the continual violation of human dignity has really been part then of an identity and has been a part of why there is conflict that we see between racial groups in the United States. An interesting dynamic we're seeing in the United States, though, and one which Donald Trump was able to capitalize on, I would say, for his own political aim, it's also this question that goes to the issue of scarcity and the issue of human dignity, and written so well in Frank's book on identity, is as we're looking at the rise of white supremacist groups, and we're looking at these groups that are identifying with their white identity in a very conflictual and engaged way, what we often see is it goes to this question of human dignity. It's not singularly driven by a view of superiority, although that is certainly part of sort of white supremacist ideology, but it's also driven by this idea of scarcity and this violation of their human dignity, that they will no longer have access to political power, or they will no longer have access to economic resources. An interesting thing, if we go back to look at Charlottesville, where we saw these white supremacist groups walking through a town chanting, they didn't chant, this is a problem about Jewish people, this is a problem about Blacks, this is a problem. What they chanted, if you go back and look at the videos, is Jews will not replace us. And that was so striking for me, because what it said is there's so much about their own dignity, the thymos that is written about this idea of dignity being at the root of their identity, or the violation of their dignity being at the root of their identity. And so to some extent, what that tells us is where there is a recognition of that human dignity and a protection of the human dignity of each person, then identity just becomes a part of who we are, but it does not become a conflictual element of society. So if we assume that we will always have identity in some way, shape, or form, the question is really, does it have to be conflictual or not? And what I would argue, and this brings me to my second point, is where we see human dignity respected, identity is then not a conflictual form. And while I approach, as a person from the democracy and human rights community, I approach human dignity as a moral issue, as our moral obligation as human beings, I also look at it from a pragmatic standpoint, which is to say, we live in a pluralistic country, we live in a pluralistic world. Different groups and identity groups coming together is the norm. The only path to human coexistence and peaceful coexistence is ensuring that human dignity is promoted and respected. And so it's not just a higher UDHR calling for us, but it is also a very pragmatic call to say that is the key to different ethnic, racial, religious, or other groups coexisting with each other in a peaceful manner, is to say, well, we certainly respect your identity, however you define it for the day or the year or your life. But we also recognize that there is a second identity or third or fourth or fifth that all of us hold. And that other identity is our human identity. And while we say that people who are in one other identity then will share a language or a culture or a religious practice, what we share in our human identity is this respect, a basis respect, which means that we don't have to agree with someone's identity. We don't have to like their identity, but we do in our other human identity and have the characteristics of coexistence and tolerance and respect that allows us to have the basis then for peaceful coexistence of groups which are radically different in many ways. And I bring that back then to this question or the point that I made at the beginning, which is this issue of we're seeing democratic recession around the world. And where we're seeing that, we're also seeing the erosion of the respect for human dignity of people around the world. And we're seeing the erosion of the exact system which allows people of different identities to come together to live peacefully. And so this debate about the role of identity and human dignity has to sit with this question of what is the system that can be built to allow people to live into that identity with human dignity in parallel with each other. So with that, I pass it back.
Okay, Nicole, thank you very much. And without further ado, Jacques, your turn. Okay, thank you.
Well, greetings to all. Thank you very much for the invitation. Great to be in touch with the Václav Havel Center in Miami. I only had a brief visit there, and it was a most interesting one, trying to compare the fate of human rights and democracy in Eastern Europe and the exit from communism, with tentative parallels or comparisons with Cuba. Okay, that will be that's more futurology, and let me immediately go to our subject of today. I think it is very useful in the material you have sent us to recall the historical connection between the notion of human dignity, inherent human dignity, and human rights, the religious background of equal dignity of all men in the eyes of God, and the understanding of human rights. However, it is then no less important to stress or to recall that the secular version of human rights emerged with the 18th century in response precisely to religious war of the 16th and 17th century. So yes, we recall the bond, or we remain aware of that bond historically, but that notion of human rights is unthinkable without the separation the Enlightenment humanism brought between religion and politics, and to the need for the legal guarantees of of those rights. There you have the connection then of a different kind in the modern democratic narrative between human rights, civic rights, and later political rights, that is representation, and then others wanted to add other rights to that, but there is a sequence that goes from the 18th to 19th century, from human rights, civic rights, to political rights. So the rule of law is absolutely crucial to that discussion, and therefore the role of the state. Frank Fukuyama referred to that. I mean, we always assume, especially those of us who were involved or accompanied the human rights movements in Eastern Europe, where it was civil society demanding rights or pressing for rights vis-a-vis an authoritarian state. In a liberal democracy, you do not have those rights without the rule of law and without the state to implement them. So that is, I think, important to stress at the beginning. I will return perhaps to the fact that the liberal democracies no longer have often the will or the capacity to implement and to promote that. And that may be a theme for our discussion. The second point I wanted to mention is how the relationship between the language of rights and identity politics, because since the end of the late 60s, basically, the projects of radical transformation of societies have been shelved, and gradually prevailed the language of rights, individual and group rights. And of course, the most significant proponents of that in Eastern Europe were the human rights movement, the Charter 77 in particular. Yes, they remain the reference point in Eastern Europe, and they also influence the thinking in Western Europe. But the parallel occurrence in Western Europe meant that the demise of Marxism, the demise of kind of socialist politics of the previous period, human rights discourse prevailed. And Marcel Gauchet wrote in 1980 a very interesting piece saying human rights is not politics. So this was in 1980, so you can trace the demise of, or the crisis or the fatigue of our politics to this temporary prevalence or triumph of the rights discourse, the liberal individualism, emancipation, self-realization. Those were the key terms of the day. And the radical 68ers, to put it bluntly, followed the old device: if you can't beat them, join them. They filtered in all the institutions, from the media to politics to even advertising. And that conversion of the 68 generation to liberalism and to the language of rights is important in the current context of what we're talking about, because they rehabilitated the language of rights in a context where occurred a shift from the universalistic understanding of it, as you have mentioned at the beginning, and in the paper you have sent us, yes, the universalist base, into a different version of it, or different understanding of it, which stresses multiculturalism and group rights. You have seen in recent years, it's particularly obvious in Europe. Perhaps I will not dare comment about the situation in United States, something one could call a proliferation of rights, or rather a proliferation of claims to rights by different groups. And there can be sexual groups, ethnic groups, all sorts of cultural minorities. And just a little side effect, Milan Kundera, the Czech writer who lives in Paris, described what he calls this a transformative energy which transforms the desires into rights. So he talks about everything has become right. The desire for love becomes a right to love, etc. And he has a whole ironic passage about that. Every desire has become right. So every group aspires to something, claims new rights. And of course, undermining the universalistic underpinning of the endeavor. So these are therefore rights not necessarily to be, so this is a debate basically, is this fostering better inclusion into the citizenship and therefore is something that can, so to speak, rejuvenate or democracy from below? Or is it are these rights rather as an opt-out from the general law in the name of the quest to preserve a specific identity? So this is where the language of rights meets the identity politics. And we have plenty of examples I will not inflict on you, but in France, it goes from what happens in schools where some groups ask exemption from certain curricula, you have, etc. I will not go into details, but there's a long list of illustrations one can give. And all this is done under the heading of defending and protecting identity and demanding new rights to protect that identity. So this is a debate that is actually crucial now in Europe, particularly in the context of large migration communities taking in, about how to accommodate diversity without losing the common bond. And of course, the migration issue is very much part of that. Since we're talking about human rights, there are people who say you should no longer distinguish between asylum seekers and migrants, because in terms of human dignity, they're all the same. And it is true. If you're talking about human dignity, the economic migrant from Senegal is just as has the same human dignity than the refugee from Syria who is fleeing bombs and a dictatorship. But it is crucially, I mean, the question then is, should you maintain the distinction? The asylum is a human rights provision under the Geneva Convention of 1951, and this is an obligation for states to accept asylum seekers who are fleeing war or dictatorship. The migrants, equal dignity, but should they have the same rights is the question. And are you helping human rights by wanting to abolish the distinction between migrants and asylum seekers? Throw it as a question, discuss for your students, perhaps. The third point I would make is am I running out of time? Martin, you must show me when I have 1 minute to go. Two, okay, two. In telegraphic style, the international context has changed. I don't have to dwell on that. But of course, if you talk about 1948, the declaration, the second moment, the Helsinki moment, the Charter 77 and the human rights movement, and what I said about the Europe united through the human rights discourse. But we now, and then we had 1989 and the democracy moment, the idea that democracy, liberal democracy, is the best guarantee for the preservation and diffusion of human rights. That was the idea. Well, I don't have to give a long speech to explain that that has been considerably undermined. This is an understatement, perhaps, in recent years. And therefore, what used to hold the credibility, let's say, of the West, who were the main promoters of this idea, has been considerably undermined outside Europe. And therefore, the cultural relativism, you remember the debate about Asian values, whether these rights are universal or not. Well, that is today considerably undermined. Final point, the conclusion, I started by saying, we moved to human dignity, the Christian concept, to human rights, the Enlightenment secular version. Now, perhaps we move back from human rights to human dignity. I think there is less faith today in these grand narratives that have prevailed after 1989. And perhaps what seems to be more pertinent, not just to me, but in the eyes of many authors, is a more modest approach that would focus on what Michael Ignatieff has called ordinary virtues, which are more palatable and more accepted by ordinary people for whom universal principles may seem too abstract. And I just give a quote. He says, human rights may be the language of states and liberal elites, but the moral language that resonates with most people is that of everyday virtues, such as trust, tolerance, forgiveness, reconciliation, resilience, etc. So we have there, from the big agenda of universal abstraction of human rights to something ordinary virtues. It rings to me a little bit like what Orwell called common decency. Perhaps a decent society, as Avishai Margaret called it, a decent society may be a goal. So the human rights revolution and the post-89 hope that this will be implemented, that changed the expectations of we had about the behavior of states. But what has changed in the way we respect our fellow citizens, let alone the needs of strangers?
Okay, thank you, Jacques, with a host of provocative questions. And now I'll pass the floor to David, who is going to moderate the remaining time when we will have opportunity to discuss ideas laid out.
Great, thanks, Martin, and thanks to terrific panelists, and for our viewers, you can send in questions on the Q&A function. I want to pick up, Frank, with you on something Jacques spoke about the proliferation of rights. And Secretary of State Pompeo launched this commission on unalienable rights. And one of its arguments was that there has been a proliferation of rights. And I think they cast that as a negative development. And in fact, they prioritized religious freedom and property rights as arguably the two most important. Can you talk a little bit about this proliferation of rights and the connection it has with a growing sense of identity that certain groups are experiencing?
Sure. This is a process that's been going on for some time. Actually, Jacques referred to this in the quote from Milan Kundera, that a lot of times desires are converted into rights because the language of rights seems to have more legitimacy or power. And basically you just want something, but you say, well, I have a right to it. And I think you've seen this happening on a number of fronts. So one has to do with constitutional rights. We make this distinction between first and second generation rights. The first generation rights are like the ones that are in the American Bill of Rights. The second generation rights have to do with social goods. My favorite example of this getting out of control is the 1988 Brazilian Constitution, which was ratified after the end of the military dictatorship. If you look at the section in that Constitution on economic and social rights, it goes on for about 15 pages. and it's very specific. You know, you have a right not just to the pursuit of happiness, but to happiness itself, and to a, you know, free education, and all of these things that nobody is ever going to possibly be able to provide people. And so it becomes a kind of wish list. So that's, you know, that's one form of this proliferation. The other form are, I think, more in principle destructive of liberalism, or the universality of rights, which again was referred to earlier, which have to do with group rights. So if you are living in a Muslim immigrant community in Europe and you say that that community has cultural rights to decide, for example, who their daughter marries, that is in direct contradiction to a liberal understanding of rights, where the rights holder is not a community, it's an individual. And if the girl doesn't want to get married, you know, I think by that universalist understanding, the family doesn't have, you know, the right to override that, except, you know, when the girl is a child, very young child or something. And that has also proliferated. And I think both of those are real problems. The trouble is, you know, it's like many things in the Trump administration, they will say something that has a kernel of truth, but then the way that they actually talk about it in detail kind of undermines their position. And so, you know, to emphasize just property and religious rights over, you know, other things, you know, speaks to their, I think, somewhat distorted policy agenda. But the general point that not everything we want, not every desire can be converted into a right, a political right, is an absolutely correct proposition.
Great. Frank, thanks very much. And I think you answered Terry Heck's question about desires becoming rights as well. Let me now turn to Nicole, to a question that has come in from Oren Steer, who's the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program, one of our co-sponsors of this event today. And Oren, I think, picking up on something you said that I don't think recognizing white supremacists' inherent human dignity will solve the problem of violence and competition for identity recognition perceived as a limited, scarce resource, and goes on to say that the notion of recognition of dignity as a solution for the problem is likely to fail. Do you want to respond to Oren's comment?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an extraordinarily important one. And I don't, in my comments in reference to white supremacists and others who have sown hate in many, many different societies, mean to indicate that we should in any way minimize the real threat that they pose to any number of societies. What I do say, though, is where we have seen either a perceived or a real suppression of human dignity, or a real or perceived exclusion from rights, you see a direct correlation to unrest. And I do think that under the Trump administration, his tap into certain groups' perceived real lack of access allowed a manipulation of a group identity to grow and to be cultivated. And I think that where there is a greater access to resources, where there is greater equity in a society, where there is greater inclusiveness in a society, it minimizes the number of people who then will take their identity and use it as a source of conflict. And so what that is, that's my reference really to the white supremacist comment. I don't think that we will eradicate hate from our society singularly by having a greater recognition of humanity, but I do believe that what it does is it prevents those people who would turn their identity into an area of conflict if we do have greater access, a greater respect for human dignity, and a greater access to resources. I hope that answered your question.
Great, Nicole, thank you. Jacques, let me ask you Nasser Muhammad's question from Pakistan, and asks, since identities are socially constructed, is it possible for an individual to switch over from one identity to another? especially for political power, resources, prestige, or even to evade persecution or genocide?
Well, certainly identities, first of all, change over time, identities of individuals and groups. And as you just said, they also can be constructed. And that is, I think, the main argument against the sort of essentialist version of identity that we see proliferating among some of the ethno-nationalists, not just in Eastern Europe, in plenty of places, in Western Europe, in the anti-immigrant discourse as well. So yes, you change of identity, but this is not something. This should be a process, and I suppose if you're talking about collective identities, I'm not now talking about just individuals, that is a process and an interaction with a group, and that very much therefore depends on the environment in which that group is operating. I think Nicole pointed that there are, to the extent that you recognize certain groups, that is one argument. If you recognize certain identities, you may favor their inclusion and therefore their evolution as part of citizenship process in the mainstream of the society. If you, on the contrary, adopt exclusionary practices, that's the argument that goes. You not only sow the seeds of conflict, but also you prevent them integrating into citizen society. This is a very difficult one. I'm in France, and the French model is very much based historically on the idea of assimilation. You're not asked where you're born. What matters is your status as a citizen, citizenship. And France doesn't, for instance, recognize minorities. So this must be shocking for Americans to hear that. There are no, in the Constitution, there is no specific things about minorities. There are plenty of provisions to accommodate diversity, of course, within that framework. And just to give you an illustration of that, when the issue came up at the Council of Europe, how do you deal with linguistic or ethnic minorities? So the French said, well, we don't have in our constitution provisions for that. What do you do? Well, you simply declare these are individual rights exercised collectively. And yeah, sorry, Martin, you wanted to?
Go ahead, Martin.
Just a question, and is it not true that we all of us have only one human dignity and multiple identities at the same time? Is it not the most critical thing that we need to live with more than one identity at the same time? As small children, maybe our identity is our family, and later when the world is opening in front of us, we are living in a world with multiple identities. And problem with identity, it seems to me, is that if one decides that his identity is only connected with his fan club, connected with a soccer team, then this identity is a little bit dangerous and weird. So is it not true that we need to be able to educate ourselves to live with multiple identities and not just with one? And is not the question of human rights not a question of entitlements that are, I would say, multiplying with all our identities, but something else, I would rather say obligation to respect others with their multiple identities?
Well, I'm sure others will have comments on that. You're preaching a converted. I'm a Prague-born Frenchman who was educated in the United States, and I'm a very committed pro-European. So the European identity is my umbrella, and underneath I have so I am that is exactly what I would call for. But of course, you need a certain framework to make that possible. No, the big debate about those multiple identities was raised recently, for instance, with the migration wave in France. And it was not just in France, it was a European, 2015, big wave, 1.5 million people turn up on the shores. And the question is, do you have, does their arrival threaten your identity? This was the discourse of Viktor Orban. He builds a fence. He says, stop here because your arrival, he calls it an invasion, threatens our identity, our collective identity. So that is one discourse. The second thing is, we have to accept them regardless of their number. This was Chancellor Merkel. In the name of human rights, in the name of European values. She said, what did she mean by European values? Universal human rights. So in the name of human rights, you open the door. Wir schaffen das. Okay, fine. The debate more in France was, you have the duty, a moral obligation to rescue somebody who is drowning in the sea. You have the duty to rescue. This is not even about human rights. This is the human dignity, if you want. You have the duty to rescue somebody who is drowning and bring him to the shore. But you also have the right, and perhaps the duty, that is to be discussed, to tell him who we are. Welcome, you are here, but this is who we are. And we happen to be a society where we separate religion from politics. We happen to be a society where we believe in the equality of men and women. We happen to be a society where, at least since Auschwitz, anti-Semitism is not acceptable. And you can enumerate sort of the 10 commandments, so to speak, of our welcome culture, as the Germans say, of what you could say. So we have the obligation, it's a moral obligation to rescue. It may be a right or perhaps a duty to also to say who we are and the way we understand rights in our society to those who come from a different civilization, different culture, and may have a different understanding. So in the name of the human dignity, we need to rescue them. And in the name of our understanding of human rights, we have to make an effort, at least, success is not guaranteed, to share with them the kind of ideas we have about living together.
Oh, I think you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point to Martin's comment about multiple identities. I think we all have multiple identities. I would flag, though, in many cases, people can't choose their identity in the sense, I think if you're talking about a soccer affiliation, yes, you can choose it. But if you are a minority in a country and there is a different access or a different treatment for minority groups, then the choice to be in that position is not one which you can necessarily shed or adjust the way you would like to. If you move to another country, yes, but I think that's the challenge, and where there is this push now, particularly in democratic societies, to say, let's think about what it actually means to extend human dignity equally to all people, is particularly for those who don't have the ability, for whom their identity is made to them more often than they choose to necessarily put it forward. And I think that's a really important tension that we're seeing throughout the world, in particularly for minority groups, immigrant groups, or groups that are not as represented in a number of places.
Frank, unless you want, if you want to jump in on this, go ahead. Otherwise, I want to shift gears for a minute.
Yeah,
okay, so let me bring in a question. Then I'm going to turn to something that Havel said from Martin's reading that he sent from Amin Senai. Given the spread of liberalism, and it may be debatable how much it's spreading these days, how long can dictatorial countries like Iran resist this process? And then if you look at a speech Havel gave in 2009 before the European Parliament in Brussels, he said, one must not retreat in the face of evil because it is in the nature of evil to take advantage of every concession. besides Europe has already had its own unfortunate experience of appeasement policies. Our support can help open-minded people or outspoken witnesses to the situation in North Korea, Burma, Iran, Tibet, Belarus, Cuba, or anywhere else, much more than we think, but it will help us too. It will help us build a better world and also to be more true to ourselves. In other words, do put into practice the values that we proclaim in general terms. So what responsibilities do we have to help people who are fighting for their rights?
Well, I can take a crack at that. I don't think that you can generalize about this, and I don't think that there's a clear moral rule that you can establish as to the extent to which you ought to pursue the defense. I mean, there's a certain level at which you do have an obligation to defend, the rights of everybody. But in the real world, the decisions are much more complex. How do you defend the rights of people in the Balkans without actually launching a fairly costly military operation that is then going to kill, there's going to be collateral damage. It's going to be very expensive. Some of your own people are going to get killed. If you want to protect the Tutsi population in Rwanda, you have similar costs associated with that, including, the political costs of getting consensus at home to use your own limited resources in that fashion. And that's why I just don't think that there's a principled way that you can do that. There's certain interventions that have happened. In fact, Kosovo is a good example where it turned out it was a lot easier than we thought it was going to be because Milosevic fell, fairly rapidly. But, there was a strong human rights argument for toppling Saddam Hussein, and I think that ended up in a big disaster. It achieved some good things, but the overall cost of it, I think, way outweighed the gains you made in terms of human rights. So that's the ground on which I think inevitably these issues have to be resolved, and it's very messy, and it's not one you can answer with a simple appeal to principle.
Nicole, let me ask you a variation of that question. You've worked in the State Department and in senior positions, including in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. Short of interventions and the use of military force, what is it that we can do to help try to promote human rights in challenging places around the world?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I'm not a believer. We've had this conversation many times. Intervention in a military sense is not how this is done. This is truly about changing, we say it too often, but changing hearts and minds. So I think there is a rhetorical responsibility. So those nations and those individuals, whether they're civic society leaders or influencers, speaking out about the importance of rights and the importance of democracy as the system that undergirds those rights is a foundational point, right? And for the places where there's not access to that information because there are repressive regimes that are controlling the movement of information, it's so important to get information and positive rhetoric into those places. I think that democratic countries and those who believe in human dignity and human rights have a responsibility to support those activists on the ground. And I know you, David, have done so much work in government and outside to support people who are human rights defenders, because those are the people who ultimately, even though they have the passport of one country and they share that passport with somebody else, they actually share values more closely with people in parts of the world where people are living freely. And so it's our responsibility to reach out to those fellow protectors of human rights and fellow spokespeople of human rights to give them the support, whether that's training, whether that's financial support or rhetorical support, that they know they have the backing of other countries or other organizations when they are fighting within their context to fight for the human dignity that we're discussing today.
So I want to, we only have 5 minutes left. I want to give Martin and Jacques the final word in response to this, and you can throw in something else, but we only have 5 minutes left between the two of you. But my question though is also, if you were asked what to recommend to the new Biden administration on human rights, what advice would you give? Go ahead,
Should I
Martin.
start?
Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead, please. And then Jacques.
First,
Last word.
okay, so Jacques, go ahead first. Then if I'm supposed to have the last word, so go
You
first.
are the organizer, you should have the last word.
All right, Jacques, you go first.
I did not expect to advise the Biden administration. It's a great honor and a great expectation from many Europeans. And I would simply say, first, draw the lessons from the past. It just has been said, what people thought they can achieve with force, military intervention, democracy promotion that way doesn't work. And secondly, the credibility of any of our discourse about human rights and democracy depends on the way we behave inside in our country, what we project. And that applies to America and to Europeans as well. So democracy promotion, human rights promotion begins at home. That is, I think, first thing. And then I would say, rule for diplomacy, speak clearly. It doesn't mean you start conflict, but you speak clearly. You name things. Camus has said, has a sentence, mal nommer les choses, c'est ajouter au malheur du monde. Wrongly name things is to add to the misery of the world. So name things clearly as they are. I think that is help. And if people get accustomed that this is not an aggression, that this is not offensive, but this is, we have the duty to ourselves and to our fellow citizens to speak truth in our diplomacy. That is very important. And then, of course, you have all that civil society and our public opinion can do. Those of us who remember the Helsinki effect, Charter 77, etc. Well, it starts with Helsinki. You remember that one? Everybody says, oh my God, isn't it a new Munich? And is it a new form of appeasement? Yeah, and what happened is that you have a human rights movement which has an echo in the West. It has the Western media gets involved, and Western public opinion interacts with diplomacy, and you create, perhaps unwittingly, something you can call a European public opinion or a European public space. So I remember, so that for me is the best advice, the memory of that experience.
Thanks,
Okay.
Jacques. Martin, last word to you.
Last word. First of all, quick reaction to what Frank said right now. Obviously, there is a difference between traditional international law, in which states have their sovereign role, and the international human rights role, in which individual is getting in a very dynamic way. Even human beings, individuals have a standing before international bodies on regional level very clearly, and there are also some mechanisms in the international level invoking international responsibility for wrongdoings in these matters. There is a long tradition of discussion concerning humanitarian intervention. Then maybe there is another unsuccessful efforts through responsibility to protect, bring together humanitarian law, Jacques mentioned, and human rights law. So there's many things. My simple recommendation to new US administration would be, please be more thoughtful, be more creative, try to re-examine certain basic principles and connect these principles and maybe some other components of US national interest with human rights thing. The question of human rights defenders is key. And very last thing, and it is my final word, Jacques mentioned Charter 77. So this is what Jan Patočka, this is what is Jan Patočka, Czech philosopher and one of the first three spokespersons of Charter 77, definition of human rights. The idea of human rights is nothing other than the conviction that even states, even societies as a whole, are subject to the sovereignty of moral sentiment, that they recognize something unconditional, that is higher than they are, something that is binding even on them, sacred, unviolable, and that in their power to establish and maintain a rule of law they seek to express this recognition. So my wish is that states, starting with the United States, think through the statement of Czech philosopher Jan Patočka.
Martin, thank you very much. You know, if we had had more time, Frank, I would have quoted a section here from your book on page 131. We'll have to do this another time. But you say democracies require deliberation and debate, which can happen only if people accept certain norms of behavior on what can be said and done. Citizens often have to accept outcomes they do not like or prefer in the interest of a common good. A culture of tolerance and mutual sympathy must override partisan passions. And given Jacques' point about the United States, I think that passage applies particularly to us these days, but we'll have to save that for another conversation. Let me first thank our co-sponsors, the Dorothea Green Lecture Series, the European and Eurasian Studies Program, the Jewish Museum of Florida at FIU, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program, African and African Diaspora Studies Program, and the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab. As you can see, a lot of our departments and programs wanted to be part of this. And I think we can all see why. First, my thanks to my colleague and friend, Martin Palush, for having the idea and helping put this program together. And then a huge thanks to Frank Fukiyama, Nicole Bibbin-Sadaka, Jacques Rupnik, an outstanding panel and discussion. I really am grateful for you taking the time and want to wish all of you the very best. And thanks to all of our viewers for tuning in. I'm David Kramer and want to thank you for joining us for this webinar to mark International Human Rights Day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.